Could Africa's revolt against Trump's old order change everything? For too long, Africa has looked inward with hesitation, nations reluctant to trade with one another, leaders slow to recognize the value in their neighbors, and people divided by invisible walls, forgetting their shared strength. But that era, it seems, is reaching its end. Antananarivo, Madagascar, August 2025. In a move that stunned global observers, Southern African nations rallying under the leadership of South Africa have issued a statement that many describe as nothing less than a geopolitical earthquake. Together, they declare their intent to pursue a new world order, a vision so bold that it even includes the possibility of building parallel institutions to stand alongside or even replace the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank. The announcement has left the world asking, why here in Madagascar? And why now, at this moment in history? Music swells. The Indian Ocean has just hosted what analysts are calling one of the most consequential African political gatherings of the 21st century. In the capital city of Antananarivo, leaders from across the Southern African Development Community, SADC, united around a message that could reshape the balance of global power. The communique released at the summit was anything but ordinary. It was not a polite request for reform. It was not a cautious plea for recognition. Instead, in the words of one diplomat present, it was a declaration of African sovereignty on the world stage. And behind those words lies a deeper reflection, a reckoning with history itself. As one senior figure explained, for decades, Africa has allowed itself to fall into a cycle of self-doubt, a pattern of self-loathing. Nations turning away from their own strengths, neighbors ignoring each other's potential. But the time for hesitation, they warned, has now run out. We've refused. We've been reluctant to trade with each other, to see and recognize each other's worth. The speaker declared, we have reached an inflection point in our history where we must recognize that we need each other desperately as African countries, as Africans. We must reach out across barriers, across boundaries, across barricades. We must lean on one another, hold each other's hands, and deepen intra-African trade. That is our only means of survival. The message delivered from the island of Madagascar was more than symbolic. It was a call to arms, not of war, but of unity, a call to break down walls, to replace suspicion with solidarity, and to build new structures that place Africa not on the sidelines of global governance, but firmly at its center. Whether this ambitious vision takes root is still uncertain. The challenges are immense, the obstacles undeniable. Yet the resolve expressed in Antananarivo makes one thing clear. Africa is no longer content to wait for permission. It is stepping forward unapologetically to claim its seat at the world's table. There has been no shortage of political speeches across Africa in recent years. But now, leaders say the time for words is over. Action must follow. The message from Botswana's president, Mogwitsi Masisi Dumaboko, was clear, deliberate, and unflinching. His words set the tone for a gathering that felt less like a routine summit and more like a turning point. One by one, leaders spoke with urgency. They rejected unilateral sanctions, describing them as tools of political coercion. They condemned what they called the selective enforcement of international law. And they vowed to accelerate new systems of trade and finance, systems designed to bypass the US dollar and strengthen the continent's independence. But the most dramatic moment came with a warning aimed directly at the world's most powerful institutions. If the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank fail to deliver meaningful reforms, Africa will not wait. Leaders declare they are ready to build their own structures. an African Security Council, a continental financial clearing system, and trade mechanisms that would operate outside Western-dominated frameworks. It was more than rhetoric. It was a blueprint for a future no longer defined by dependency, a call to accelerate Africa's march toward an industrialized, resilient society, one where citizens enjoy food security, nutrition, and energy self-sufficiency. There were also moments of reflection where optimism cut through the urgency. Leaders pointed to progress in protecting and managing the continent's natural wealth. They highlighted the SADC Transfrontier Conservation Area International Conference and Summit, held this May in Accra. That gathering, they said, reaffirmed Africa's shared commitment to sustainable development, to harnessing resources in ways that benefit local communities for generations to come. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa's dream of integration is built on a foundation of connection. Free movement of people, goods, capital, and services across borders. And while milestones have been achieved, from high-impact infrastructure projects to cross-border cooperation, leaders admitted the work is far from finished. Strategic transport corridors, one-stop border posts, and digital networks must remain top priorities if the continent is to unleash its full potential. Yet there is a constant obstacle: money. Budgetary constraints continue to weigh heavily on progress, and so leaders stress the need for inventive, sustainable funding models. They called not only on governments but on private investors, the African diaspora, and other non-traditional partners to step forward. One opportunity stood out: the SADC Regional Development Fund. Leaders described it as low-hanging fruit, a tool that, once fully operational, could provide alternative financing for the infrastructure Africa urgently needs. Taken together, the message was unmistakable. The era of waiting is over. Africa is preparing to write its own chapter in global history, with its own institutions, its own systems, and its own future. Let's take a brief moment to thank the Black Culture Diary community, an important space where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and uplifted. By joining as a member, you're not only supporting this channel, but also becoming part of a wider cultural movement. Now back to the story. Observers described the tone of the recent summit as defiant but measured. Delegates did not raise their voices or engage in dramatic posturing. Instead, they spoke with a calm, steady confidence, one that reportedly unsettled Western envoys watching from the sidelines. The message, according to those present, was striking in its simplicity. Africa is no longer asking, it is acting. But leaders also recognize that bold declarations inside conference halls mean little unless they connect with the everyday lives of ordinary Africans. In Madagascar, where the summit was held, this reality seemed to shape much of the discussion. Beyond debates on global governance and international financial systems, one theme kept resurfacing: Africa's future depends on the empowerment of its youth and women. Without this foundation, speakers warned, talk of overturning the existing order risks remaining symbolic rather than transformative. The statistics illustrate why this issue is so urgent. Africa is the youngest continent on the planet, with more than 60% of its people under the age of 25. By 2050, it is projected that 1 in 3 young people worldwide will be African. This demographic wave carries immense weight. Analysts note it could either deepen challenges such as unemployment, migration pressures, and instability, or serve as a powerful engine for innovation, productivity, and cultural influence. Leaders in Antananarivo framed it. The situation is clear. If Africa fails its youth, the entire project collapses. But if it empowers them, no external force can hold the continent back. Women were also placed firmly at the center of the conversation. For generations, they have been the backbone of African agriculture, markets, and households. yet they remain underrepresented in leadership and decision-making roles. Several speakers emphasize that no continent can claim true sovereignty while excluding half of its population. Delegates pointed out that throughout centuries of colonialism, slavery, and structural adjustment, Africa's survival was sustained largely by women, often unseen, yet absolutely essential. Now, they argued, women's contributions must be made visible, formalized, and central to the continent's future. Importantly, this was not framed as charity or symbolic inclusion. Instead, it was presented as a strategy for success. The idea is simple. A continent that harnesses both the energy of its youth and the leadership of its women does not merely catch up to the rest of the world. It has the potential to set the global pace. Real-world examples already reflect this possibility. Across the continent, young African tech entrepreneurs are driving fintech revolutions. Women-led cooperatives are transforming agriculture. Grassroots climate activists are spearheading sustainability projects, many of which global NGOs later seek to replicate. The message emerging from Antananarivo was therefore clear. Africa's path to the future depends not only on bold diplomacy or global demands, but on empowering the very people who hold the continent's greatest potential, its young and its women. Africa does not stand in need of imported blueprints. It already carries within it the brilliance of talent, the spark of ideas, and the strength of resilience. What it seeks above all are systems, frameworks that allow those qualities to rise and flourish. And here begins the heart of the argument. African solutions to African problems. For far too long, when crises struck the continent, whether in health and security or in development, the answers were written far away in distant Western capitals. But the results of those prescriptions often created not independence, but dependency. That is why the voices at the Madagascar summit rose with conviction. Their demand was clear. Only Africans can design the solutions that match African realities. From the battles against insurgencies, to the struggles of managing debt, to the urgent fight against climate change, leaders insisted that homegrown strategies hold more strength, more sustainability than any externally imposed fix. Consider security. For years, Western interventions in the Sahel have stumbled, leaving behind a trail of instability that has deepened rather than healed. In response, African nations are beginning to chart a new course, regional defense initiatives built on local knowledge and collective responsibility. Not foreign boots on the ground, but African leadership standing tall. The same truth appears. In agriculture, donor-driven industrial projects have often faltered, while local solutions, community seed banks, climate-resilient indigenous crops, have flourished with promise. And so the message that echoed out of Madagascar was not one of isolationism, but of ownership. Partnerships with the world are welcome, but never at the cost of Africa's agency. Leaders declared that the empowerment of youth and women is not only a domestic need, it is the continent's greatest bargaining chip on the global stage. If Africa can show that it is building prosperity from within, by mobilizing its own people and solving its own crises, it can flip the narrative forever, from one of victimhood to one of leadership. This vision also demanded inclusion. Leaders spoke of the necessity to raise the representation of women, of youth, and of persons with disabilities in every sphere, social, economic, and political. And on the ground, action followed words, together with His Excellency Advocate. Mokgweetsi Masisi, President of the Republic of Botswana, regional leaders commissioned the construction of a new logistics depot in Botswana. This facility is designed to play a vital role in strengthening preparedness and response in times of conflict and humanitarian emergency. Gratitude was voiced to the government and the people of Botswana for their support in making this a reality. At the same time, member states were urged to provide the funding required to ensure its timely completion. The peace and stability now holding across parts of the region were celebrated as achievements worth recognition, living proof of a joint commitment to silencing the guns. Leaders took a moment to commend the outgoing chairperson of the organ, Excellency Dr. Samir Hassan, along with the organ's member states, for their tireless work across the past year in advancing durable peace and stability. This determination has been visible most of all in the eastern territories of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There, 5 former African heads of state have been appointed to guide inclusive dialogue, to help rebuild trust, and to carry forward peace-building initiatives. And so the message was clear. Africa is claiming ownership of its future by drawing on its own people, its own knowledge, and its own resilience. The continent is signaling a decisive shift. No longer waiting for solutions written elsewhere, but standing firm with solutions that are not imported, but proudly and powerfully homegrown. This week, the spotlight turned to Madagascar, where the joint SADC-EAC summit delivered a message that was impossible to ignore. Leaders welcomed its outcome, hailing it as another step in Africa's long-held philosophy. African solutions to African problems. The summit did not stand alone. Peace agreements brokered by the United States and Qatar were also recognized, not as rivals to Africa's own efforts, but as parallel tracks that reinforce a common destination: peace, stability, and development across the eastern territories. Before we go further, a quick reminder: if you value stories that go deeper, stories of Black culture, history, civilization, and identity, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's continue. Inside the summit halls of Madagascar, one theme echoed louder than any other. Africa cannot transform the world order without the will and participation of its own people. Not just presidents and ministers, but citizens. Every African, everywhere. This was not diplomacy as usual. It was more than strategy or protocol. What unfolded was something closer to a rallying cry, a plea not for foreign aid, but for self-recognition. Leaders called on Africans to see the continent's struggle as their own personal struggle, to bind their future to Africa's destiny. According to reports, one president rose and declared to the room, "We can resist sanctions. We can defy our pressure, but we cannot prevail if our people remain divided by tribe, by class, by borders, or by the Atlantic Ocean separating us from our diaspora." That reference to the diaspora was deliberate. More than 200 million people of African descent live beyond the continent, scattered across the Americas, Europe, and beyond. For centuries, they have carried Africa's culture, resisted slavery and colonialism, and lent their voices to global struggles for justice. Now, leaders are urging them to act again, not through romantic notions of returning home, but through practical strength. They called for investment, for advocacy, for the transfer of technology, and for political influence applied in Western capitals. And what made this appeal resonate was its clarity. It was not a nostalgic dream. It was a demand rooted in reality. Use the positions already held in finance, in academia, in technology, and in politics to reinforce Africa's hand. Challenge distorted narratives in Western media. Fuel African startups. Pressure lawmakers to rethink unfair trade laws. Because while governments can negotiate, only the diaspora can wield certain tools that Africa itself does not fully control. But the message was not only outward. Inside Africa, the urgency was just as sharp. The Madagascar summit laid bare a long-standing paradox. Africa speaks of unity, yet fractures persist. Ethnic divisions, partisan rivalries, and deep class inequalities continue to splinter continental ambitions. By declaring that Africa needs every African, leaders were admitting a hard truth. Governments alone cannot deliver sovereignty. True transformation requires citizens to see beyond narrow interests, beyond borders, beyond tribe and faction, and instead align with a vision of collective liberation. This was not simply another summit. It was a stage where Africa's future was spoken of not as a dream, but as a challenge, one that demands every hand, every voice, and every heart, both on the continent and far beyond it. The urgency of Africa's cry for unity does not come lightly. It rises from the recognition that pressures from the outside world are closing in on all sides. Sanctions, climate shocks, foreign interference, and debt traps, forces that strike at the heart of fragile progress, are multiplying. No single government can bear such weight alone, but a continent united, mobilizing every African mind, every hand, every resource, becomes far harder to bend, far harder to silence. Across the vast breadth of the continent, hundreds of thousands of citizens remain trapped in the unforgiving grip of poverty and unemployment. Africa is in distress. Its voice trembles with urgency, calling out to each of us. That cry is not just a lament. It is a call to rescue, a demand for immediate response, not tomorrow, not in some distant future, but here and now. And so leaders rise with clarity. The institutions that once defined Africa, the rigid ways in which societies have been organized, the traditions that became habits, the systems once normalized, all of them must yield to new ways of thinking. The future requires transformation. Bold, radical, progressive. What unfolded in Madagascar in August 2025 was far more than a summit. It was a declaration, a warning shot fired across the bow of the old order. Africa would no longer stand waiting at the gates of global power. Instead, it would lay the foundation for its own house. For the first time in generations, the voices of Africa's leaders, its youth, and its diaspora were spoken in the same breath. Not as fragments scattered by history, but as pieces of a whole, finally ready to move as one. But unity comes with its own trials. The hardest work still lies ahead. To build parallel institutions will test the continent's endurance. To empower every citizen will test its courage. And to unite across borders will test its maturity. Yet Madagascar proved one undeniable truth. Africa has crossed the line. It has moved from waiting to acting. The world has noticed. Africa is no longer simply asking for a place in the existing order. It is demanding one. And if denied, analysts suggest, it may create its own order, an order where Africa's voice is no longer an echo, but a drumbeat. Whether that rhythm inspires or unsettles depends on where one chooses to stand in history. And now, one question overshadows all others. When the history of the 21st century is finally written, will Madagascar be remembered as the place where Africa declared its future, or the place where old powers realized too late that the balance of the world had already begun to turn? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Can Africa chart its own course, free from the weight of old systems? If you want to see more stories like this, uncovering the hidden history, the culture, the civilization, and the evidence of Africa's enduring greatness, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon. Thank you for watching, and until the next story unfolds, stay tuned.